The silk of my parachute tore through the darkness with a sound like ripping flesh as flak burst around me, painting the night sky with brief crimson flashes that illuminated the horror of our scattered drop. Men tumbled through the air like broken dolls, some with shoots blossoming too late, others vanishing into the hungry maw of the Ardennes forest below. My own descent became a violent plummet as branches clawed at my face, my equipment, my very soul. I crashed through the canopy, the impact driving precious air from my lungs as I dangled momentarily suspended between heaven and earth. When I cut myself free, I fell the final 15 feet to the forest floor, landing in a tangle of webbing and limbs that miraculously remained unbroken. The sounds of distant death, muffled gunfire, abrupt screams terminated with unsettling suddenness, the occasional desperate call of a name, filtered through the ancient trees that seemed to absorb these human intrusions with indifferent patience. The forest felt alive around me, watching with the dispassionate curiosity of a predator assessing unfamiliar prey. I recovered my equipment bundle by what I then believed was fortune, but later understood was deliberate design. As if the forest wanted me armed, wanted us all to believe we stood a chance against what lurked in its shadowed heart. My fingers, slick with blood from a dozen shallow cuts, fumbled with my Thompson, the cold metal of the submachine gun offering an illusion of security that I clung to with the desperation of a drowning man clutching at floating debris. By first light, a grey, anemic dawn that barely penetrated the dense foliage, I had found 6 others from my company. Sergeant Frank Weber, a butcher's son from Philadelphia with eyes that had seen too much at Salerno. Corporal Alan Jenkins, our radio man whose perpetual nervous tick of adjusting his glasses intensified with each passing hour. Private Gareth Monroe, barely 19, a farm boy from Nebraska whose innocent face seemed obscenely out of place in this theater of murder. Private Thomas Harkins, a former seminary student whose faith had transformed into something harder and more desperate in the crucible of war. Private Michael Sullivan, a Boston Irishman with quick fists and quicker wit. And Private David Bishop, a school teacher from Vermont who spoke 5 languages but had fallen silent since our landing. Weber's face, normally impassive, betrayed concern as he checked his maps and realized the devastating truth. We were miles from our designated drop zone, deep behind enemy lines, with no functioning radio and no clear path to our objective. "We're blown off course, scattered all to hell," he said, his voice unnaturally loud in the forest's oppressive silence. "Command thinks we're somewhere else entirely." As rain began to fall, a cold, persistent drizzle that penetrated our uniforms and settled into our bones like arthritis, Weber led us toward a structure he'd spotted through his field glasses. An abandoned hunting lodge nestled against a ridge of ancient rock formations that resembled nothing so much as grasping fingers. The lodge itself seemed to repel the eye, its proportions subtly wrong in ways I couldn't articulate. From the moment we approached its weathered door, I felt observed, not by human eyes, but by something colder, something that measured our worth by standards incomprehensible to mortal minds. Inside, the walls were lined with mounted trophies, stags, boars, wolves, and birds I couldn't name, their glass eyes all oriented in the same direction regardless of where they were positioned, as if some distant sight had captured their eternal attention at the moment of their second death. That first night, as I took watch by the window while my companions sought restless sleep, a flash of lightning illuminated the tree line. There, standing motionless between 2 ancient oaks, was a figure of such wrongness that my mind initially refused to process what my eyes beheld. Impossibly tall and thin, its limbs elongated beyond any human proportion, its head tilted at an angle that would have snapped a normal spine. When I blinked, it was gone, but the afterimage remained burned into my vision like a photographic negative, a silhouette of something that had no right to exist in a world governed by rational laws. Monroe's sleepwalking began on our 3rd night at the lodge. I was startled awake by Weber's harsh whisper as he intercepted the young private at the front door, his eyes open yet unseeing, his movements mechanical as a wind-up toy. "The chalk man waits," Monroe mumbled as Weber guided him back to his cot, his voice carrying the flat, affectless quality of a gramophone recording. "He's drawing me, piece by piece. He needs to finish the outline." In daylight, Monroe remembered nothing of these nocturnal wanderings, but a shadow had taken residence behind his eyes, a haunted quality that made him flinch at sudden movements and stare too long into the dense undergrowth during our increasingly tense patrols. Weber ordered us to maintain pairs at all times, but this precaution did nothing to dispel the growing certainty that we were being stalked. The thing revealed itself in fragments, a flash of movement glimpsed through dense foliage, the impossible silhouette momentarily visible at the periphery of our vision, always maintaining its distance with the patient confidence of a predator that knows its territory and its prey's limitations. Most disturbing were the signs of its intrusion into our supposed sanctuary. We would return from patrols to find our personal items subtly rearranged, photographs of sweethearts and family turned upside down or backward in their frames, letters refolded with military precision but in patterns none of us had made, dog tags arranged in geometric configurations that made my eyes hurt to look upon them directly. Jenkins, our radio man, became convinced that someone was tampering with the equipment during our absences, though the radio itself remained stubbornly silent except for bursts of static that sometimes formed patterns, suggestive of words in no language any of us recognized. The first physical evidence appeared innocuously, small white fragments in our boots each morning, resembling chalk or limestone, though none of us carried such materials. Sullivan initially accused Monroe of playing pranks, an accusation that nearly led to blows until Weber intervened. "Nobody's pulling anything," he growled, his hand resting meaningfully on his sidearm. "And nobody's losing their grip, you understand? This is probably local stone getting tracked in." But his explanation lost credibility on the 5th day, when I discovered the first marking, a partial outline drawn in chalk on the floorboards beside Monroe's cot, stopping abruptly where Weber had begun ordering him tied down at night. The line was precise, too perfect for a human hand, its contours suggesting the beginning of a form far larger than Monroe's slender frame. Weber dismissed it as gallows humor, a prank by one of us to lighten the oppressive atmosphere, but no one confessed, and the looks we exchanged contained equal measures of suspicion and fear. That night, as rain battered the lodge's roof with the staccato rhythm of distant machine gun fire, Bishop broke his self-imposed silence. "There's a pattern to it all," he whispered, his academic's mind desperately seeking rationality in our increasingly irrational circumstances. "The animal heads, the rearrangements, the chalk, it's studying us, learning our shapes, our habits, our essence." Sullivan told him to shut his mouth, but the tension among us had become a palpable thing, an entity unto itself that circulated like poisoned air. Jenkins reported finding strange white flowers blooming around the lodge perimeter despite the unseasonable cold, their petals luminous in the darkness as if gently phosphorescent. When he finally coaxed a weak signal from the radio that evening, the transmission we received made no sense. Coordinates for a location hundreds of miles away, followed by a phrase repeated in French, "Il nous dessine dans la mort." Bishop's translation hung in the air between us like an executioner's proclamation. "He draws us in death." The storm that hit on our 14th night transformed the forest into a howling chaos of thrashing branches and sheeting rain, lightning striking with unnatural frequency, as if heaven itself was attacking the ancient woods. Monroe drew the midnight watch, and when I approached to relieve him at 0200 hours, a blinding lightning strike momentarily robbed me of vision. When my sight cleared, he was gone, vanished, with only his rifle left propped against the windowsill with mechanical precision. Weber found the evidence outside, a perfect chalk outline on the ground where Monroe would have patrolled, the white lines unnaturally visible despite the torrential rain, elongated in proportions matching the figure we'd glimpsed stalking us. Our search yielded only more chalk markings scratched into trees, leading nowhere. While back at the lodge, Sullivan discovered a hidden journal dating to the 1840s, filled with accounts and sketches of the same elongated entity and records of disappearances stretching back centuries. As Sullivan closed the ancient book, I noticed white chalk dust beneath his fingernails that hadn't been there during our search. When confronted, terror flooded his face as he whispered, "I can feel it in my head, showing me how to draw the outlines, showing me what I'll become," before begging to be restrained as Monroe had been, describing something calling from the forest, promising to complete his outline. We encountered the Wehrmacht patrol while seeking escape routes toward the distant artillery rumble indicating Allied lines. 5 German soldiers emerging from the undergrowth, weapons half raised in that eternal moment before combat, when their gaunt Hauptmann defied all military protocol by lowering his Luger and calling out in accented English, "You have seen it, ja? Der Kreidemann, the chalk man." The name struck us like physical blows, confirming our horrors were no hallucination, and within hours we formed an unprecedented alliance over shared rations and common terror. Hauptmann Baumann, once an anthropology professor at Heidelberg, explained how his 30-man company had dwindled to 5 through identical disappearances, sentries vanishing, leaving only chalk outlines, their possessions rearranged and chalk fragments appearing in their boots. From an elderly Frenchman they'd captured, Baumann had extracted folklore about Le Dessinateur, an entity that had haunted the Ardennes for centuries, emerging during times of bloodshed to harvest souls in equal measure from both sides of any conflict, maintaining some cosmic balance. Despite our combined vigilance that night, American and German soldiers standing watch together, using protective symbols Baumann had carved into his rifle and herbs distributed from his pack. We woke to find one of his men missing, a perfect chalk outline where he'd slept, with white flowers already sprouting along its edges as if fertilized by his essence. We made our final push toward Allied lines as artillery fire drew closer, our bizarre coalition moving as a tight unit through the forest, following Baumann's superstitious precautions, carrying herbs and salt, avoiding chalk markings, never looking directly at the white flowers that bloomed in our path. Sullivan had grown increasingly unstable, his hands sometimes moving in drawing motions he couldn't control. Bishop maintained a scholarly detachment that fooled no one. Jenkins had abandoned the radio after it broadcast what sounded like Monroe's voice. Harkins prayed constantly, and the Germans flinched at every sound, one repeatedly scratching at chalk marks appearing on his skin. The entity revealed itself as we approached the forest's edge, the temperature plummeting unnaturally despite summer heat. A towering figure 12 feet tall with limbs elongated like pulled taffy, skin white as chalk that absorbed light rather than reflected it, its face a suggestion rather than a finished form. With a piece of ancient limestone, it drew glowing lines in the air, perfect segments of human outlines, our outlines, and as it completed mine, I felt something essential being pulled from my chest toward the ephemeral shape. Sullivan broke first, firing uselessly through its form, shattering whatever spell held us paralyzed. We ran toward the sunlit fields where American troops advanced, and as we crossed some invisible threshold, white dust fell from our skin in clouds while the German soldiers collapsed, their outlines suddenly burned into the earth beneath their unmarked corpses. Though I survived to see the war's end, I still find traces of chalk in my boots each morning, and in my dreams, I see the entity completing thousands of outlines from both sides of the conflict. A cosmic principle given form, neither good nor evil, but utterly indifferent, recording the one certainty that unites all soldiers, that death draws each of us, eventually, into its patient, perfect outline.